The world feared her. Only the humans saw beyond the monster. The docking bay of Nexus Prime fell silent as the transport vessel's airlock hissed open. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across the metal grating, and the usual bustle of interspecies commerce ground to a halt. Merchants, travelers, and station personnel alike pressed themselves against the walls, their various forms of breathing apparatus working overtime as fear pheromones, electromagnetic pulses, and other species-specific distress signals filled the air. From the ship's darkened interior emerged a figure that seemed to absorb the light around it. Kira moved with fluid grace despite her imposing height, her form wrapped in what appeared to be living shadow. Multiple eyes, some the size of dinner plates, others mere pinpricks of silver light, dotted her elongated skull, constantly scanning the terrified crowd. Her limbs were too long, too angular, ending in appendages that shifted between delicate manipulator tendrils and razor-sharp talons depending on her emotional state. The Vorthak had arrived. Commander Thane, his reptilian scales flushed with stress colors, activated his personal shield generator and spoke into his communicator with barely controlled panic. "Code Black, I repeat, Code Black, Vorthak entity on station. All security personnel to Docking Bay 7 immediately." David Chen, recently assigned human diplomat, stood frozen among the crowd. Unlike the others, his paralysis came not from terror, but from recognition. He had spent months studying the classified files on the Vorthak, learning their tragic history, understanding what they once were before the galaxy's nightmares transformed them into living weapons. As Kira's multitude of eyes swept across the crowd, several of them lingered on him with what he could only describe as desperate hope. The station's automated systems began their standard xenophobic protocols, barriers rising from the floor to contain the perceived threat. Kira didn't fight them. Instead, she slowly folded her massive form into the smallest configuration possible, her shadows pulling inward until she appeared almost human in size. The gesture was unmistakably submissive, a plea for peaceful coexistence that went unnoticed by everyone except David. "Please," Kira spoke, her voice a harmonic blend of tones that resonated through multiple spectrums. "I seek only sanctuary, I mean no harm." A Zolonian trader near the back of the crowd shrieked and fainted, his crystalline form shattering into emergency stasis. The sound seemed to trigger a cascade of panic responses across the gathering. Within moments, the docking bay was empty except for security personnel, pointing weapons at the contained Vorthak, and one human diplomat who couldn't bring himself to leave. Dr. Mira, David's colleague and friend, grabbed his arm. "David, we need to go, now. The emergency protocols are clear about Vorthak contact." He shook her off gently but firmly. "Look at her, Mira. Really look. She's not attacking. She's not even defending herself. She's just asking for help. That's exactly what makes her dangerous." Commander Thane interjected, his weapon trained on Kira. "The Vorthak don't attack directly. They infiltrate, they corrupt, they turn entire worlds into extensions of themselves. Every species in the galaxy knows this." David stepped forward, ignoring the shocked gasps from the security team. Every species knows the stories, but how many know the truth? Kira's eyes fixed on him as he approached the barrier. Up close, he could see the intricate patterns in her shadow, wreathed form, the way her tendrils moved with artistic precision rather than predatory intent. Most importantly, he could see the profound exhaustion in her ancient gaze. "I know what you are," David said quietly. "Not what they made you into, but what you were before, what you still are underneath." For the first time in decades, Kira allowed herself to hope. This human, this impossible human, was speaking to her as if she were a person rather than a monster. Her form began to shift. the shadows pulling back slightly to reveal hints of the delicate artistry that had once defined her species. "You cannot know," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics of profound sadness. "My people, we were gardeners of worlds, sculptors of reality itself. We sang stars into being and crafted planets like jewelry. But the devourers found us, corrupted us, turned our gifts into weapons of conquest. I carry the genetic memory of 10,000 years of forced violence." The security team shifted nervously, their weapons humming with increased charge. Commander Thane's scales were now flashing aggressive patterns. "Chen, step away from the containment field. That's a direct order." David ignored him, placing his hand against the barrier. The energy field sparked where his palm touched it, but he didn't pull away. "I've read the classified reports. The Vorthak weren't conquerors. They were slaves, genetically modified by the Devourers to serve as living weapons. When they finally broke free, they tried to undo the damage, but by then the galaxies saw them only as monsters." Kira's form trembled as she reached out with one delicate tendril to mirror his gesture on the other side of the barrier. Where their hands would have touched, the energy field created a light show of impossible colors. "You understand," she breathed. "But understanding cannot change what I am, what I was forced to become. It can change what you choose to be now," David replied. "You came here seeking sanctuary. Why?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kira's multiple eyes began to glow with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to calm the electromagnetic disturbances in the air. "Because I dream of them, the Devourers. They stir in the void between galaxies, sensing weakness in the Alliance. The same hunger that consumed my people, that forced us to become weapons, grows strong again, and I am the only one who remembers how to recognize their touch. Pritkonking or mold, COMMNDERRF2FI, someone TH, LNES, Elzesses EXPECTATIONS lowered slightly. "You're saying there's a threat coming?" "Not coming," Kira corrected, her form beginning to expand as urgency overcame her careful self-control. "Already here, hidden in the shadows between dimensions, testing the boundaries of reality itself. The signs are subtle, but I carry the genetic memory of their methods. They begin with whispers, with small corruptions that spread like infections through the quantum foam." Dr. Mira stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "What kind of signs?" Kira's shadows began to move in complex patterns, creating holographic displays that showed impossible geometries and dimensional distortions. Ships disappearing not in space, but in the gaps between space. Communication arrays receiving messages from coordinates that don't exist. Reality itself becoming soft in certain regions. The security team exchanged nervous glances. Several of them had heard reports of exactly these phenomena from the Outer Rim systems, but the Alliance had dismissed them as equipment malfunctions or sensor ghosts. "If this is true," David said slowly, "then you're not just seeking sanctuary. You're trying to warn us." "I am trying to prepare you," Kira replied. "My people were caught unprepared. We were artists, philosophers, builders of beauty. When the Devourers came, we had no defenses against their reality, warping weapons. They didn't just conquer us, they rewrote us at the genetic level, turned our gifts for creation into compulsions for destruction." The implications began to sink in. If the Devourers were returning, if they were already probing the Alliance's defenses, then the galaxy's greatest nightmare was about to become reality once again. Commander Thane slowly holstered his weapon. "The Council needs to hear this, but they won't listen to a Vorthak. The fear runs too deep. Then they'll listen to me," David said firmly. "And I'll make sure they understand that she's not our enemy. She's our only hope of survival." As if responding to his words, the station's proximity alarms began to wail. In the distance, beyond the viewport, space itself seemed to ripple like water. Something vast and impossible was emerging from the void. its form shifting between dimensions in ways that hurt to perceive directly. Kira's multiple eyes flared with recognition and ancient terror. They're here. The first Devourer ship materialized at the edge of the system, its hull a writhing mass of non-Euclidean geometry that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Wherever its weapons touched space, reality simply ceased to exist, leaving wounds in the fabric of existence itself. The station's defenses opened fire, but their energy beams passed through the enemy ship as if it weren't entirely there. The Devourer vessel responded by releasing a wave of corruption that washed over the station's outer hull, causing metal to flow like liquid and technology to sprout organic growths that pulsed with malevolent life. All ships evacuate immediately. Commander Thane broadcast on all frequencies. We are under attack by unknown hostiles. Repeat, evacuate immediately. But there would be no evacuation. The Devourer ship's reality, warping field, had already begun to affect the station's jump drives, turning the quantum tunnels into twisted mazes that led nowhere. They were trapped, facing an enemy that existed partially outside normal space-time. David looked at Kira, who was now fully expanded to her true size, her shadow, wreathed form filling the entire docking bay. You said you remember how to recognize their touch. Do you remember how to fight them? Kira's form began to shift, and for the first time, David saw the weapon that the Vorthak had been forced to become. Her delicate tendrils hardened into blade, like projections. Her artistic shadows became armor of living darkness, and her multiple eyes began to glow with the fury of a species that had been enslaved for millennia. I remember everything, she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated through multiple dimensions. Every torture, every forced transformation, every act of violence they compelled my people to commit. But I also remember something else, something they never intended for us to learn. The station shuddered as the Devourer ship's influence spread, reality becoming increasingly unstable. Through the viewports, David could see other ships in the system beginning to change, their hulls growing organic appendages and their crews being transformed into extensions of the Devourer hive mind. What do you remember? David asked, his hand still pressed against the barrier that separated them. Love, Kira replied, her form now radiating power that made the air itself sing with harmonic frequencies. They turned us into weapons, but they couldn't erase what we were, and what we were was love itself. Love for beauty, for creation, for the infinite possibilities of existence. That love is still there, buried beneath the modifications, waiting to be remembered. The barrier between them flickered and died as the station's power systems began to fail. For the first time in decades, Kira was free to move without restraint. Every being in the docking bay tensed, expecting violence. Instead, she extended one delicate tendril toward David, offering him a choice. Will you help me remember who I was before they made me into what I am? David didn't hesitate. He reached out and took her offered appendage, feeling the surprising warmth of her touch, the gentle strength that spoke of creation rather than destruction. I'll help you remember, but more than that, I'll help you become who you choose to be. The moment their hands touched, something extraordinary happened. Kira's genetic memories, locked away for millennia, began to surface. But instead of the violent conditioning that had defined her existence, she remembered the beauty her people had created, the worlds they had nurtured, the songs they had sung to bring stars to life. Her form began to change again, not into the weapon she had been forced to become, but into something new, a fusion of her people's original gifts and their hard-won knowledge of warfare. She was no longer just a Vorthak warrior or a Vorthak artist. She was something unprecedented, a guardian. I remember now, she said, her voice filled with wonder. We were never meant to be weapons. We were meant to be gardeners tending the galaxy like a vast garden. But gardens sometimes need protection from those who would destroy them. The Devourer's ship had begun to extend reality, warping tendrils toward the station, seeking to corrupt and absorb everything in its path. Where they touched, the station's hull began to sprout impossible geometries, and the crew members caught in their influence screamed as their bodies were remade into hybrid forms. Kira released David's hand and stepped toward the nearest viewport. Her shadows expanded, not as a weapon but as a shield, creating a barrier of living darkness that the Devourer's corruption couldn't penetrate. "I can hold them back," she said, "but not forever. The station needs to be evacuated. The jump drives are corrupted," Commander Thane reported. "We can't leave the system. Then we make our stand here," David said, moving to stand beside Kira. All of us together. Dr. Mira was already working at her portable console, analyzing the readings from the Devourer's ship. "The reality distortions follow a pattern," she announced. "It's not random. They're following some kind of geometric progression. If we can predict where they'll manifest next, we can create counter-harmonics," Kira finished, her ancient knowledge filling in the gaps. "My people learned to do this during the slave years. We couldn't fight back directly, but we could create small pockets of stability in the chaos." Working together, they began to coordinate the station's defenses. Kira's shadows provided protection from the reality warping effects, while the station's conventional weapons targeted the areas where the Devourer's ship became fully corporeal. It was a desperate strategy, but it was working. The Devourer's ship, frustrated by their resistance, began to manifest more fully in normal space-time. As it did, it became vulnerable to conventional weapons, but it also became exponentially more dangerous. The creature piloting it, for the ship was as much a living being as a vessel, began to sing in frequencies that drove lesser species to madness. "It's trying to break our minds," Commander Thane reported through gritted teeth. "The psychic harmonics are overwhelming our neural dampeners." Kira's form expanded further, her shadows now encompassing the entire docking bay. "I can sing," she said. "My people were forced to learn their songs, but I need everyone to trust me, to let me into your minds just enough to protect you from their influence." It was an impossible request. Allowing a Vorthak into one's mind was considered the ultimate violation, a fate worse than death. But as the Devourer's song grew stronger and crew members throughout the station began to collapse in agony, the choice became clear. David stepped forward first. "I trust you." One by one, the others followed. Commander Thane, his scales now pale with fear, but his jaw set with determination. Dr. Mira, her scientific mind fascinated despite the danger. The security team, trained to face death but not to face trust. As they opened their minds to her, Kira felt their thoughts and emotions wash over her. Their fears, their hopes, their desperate determination to protect everything they held dear. And in that moment of connection, she remembered something else her people had lost: the joy of communion, of sharing consciousness with others, not to dominate but to understand. Her counter-song began as a whisper, then grew into a harmony that encompassed not just her own voice, but the voices of everyone connected to her. Human determination, Thane's reptilian stoicism, Mira's scientific curiosity, and the fierce loyalty of the security team all blended into a song of defiance that pushed back against the Devourer's mental assault. The enemy ship recoiled as if struck, its reality, warping field flickering. For a moment, it existed fully in normal space, and the station's weapons found their mark. Explosions rippled across its hull, and the creature within screamed in pain and fury. But the victory was temporary. The Devourer's ship began to split, revealing that it was not one creature but many, each one a corrupted member of a species that had been absorbed and transformed. David recognized the remains of Zilonian crystal formations, the twisted hulk of what had once been a Thane-class battlecruiser, and dozens of other vessels that had been consumed and remade. It's not just a ship, he realized. It's a graveyard. Every species they've ever conquered, every world they've ever consumed. Kira's form shuddered as she recognized the truth. My people are in there, what's left of them. They're still slaves, still being forced to fight against their will. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a rescue mission. Somewhere, in that writhing mass of corrupted flesh and twisted metal, were the remnants of her people, still conscious, still suffering after millennia of bondage. We have to free them, she said, her voice carrying new determination. All of them, every species that was taken, every world that was consumed. They're still in there, waiting for someone to remember that they were more than weapons. The Devourer swarm began to advance on the station, each corrupted vessel seeking to add Nexus Prime to its collection. But as they approached, something unexpected happened. Kira's song, amplified by her connection to the station's crew, began to reach the enslaved consciousnesses within the enemy ships. Deep within the Devourer collective, minds that had been dormant for centuries began to stir. The song carried with it not just defiance, but memory of who they had been before the corruption, before the transformation, before the endless slavery. One by one, the corrupted vessels began to slow, their movements becoming erratic as the enslaved minds within them remembered their true nature. The Devourer collective, which had operated as a single hive mind for so long, began to fragment as individual consciousnesses reasserted themselves. It's working, Dr. Mira breathed. The collective is breaking down. They're remembering who they were. But the victory came at a cost. The primary Devourer entity, the ancient intelligence that had orchestrated the corruption of countless worlds, began to manifest directly. It was a creature of pure nightmare, existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions, its form constantly shifting between states of matter and energy. I am the hunger between stars, it spoke, its voice resonating through space, time itself. I am the silence after the last song, the darkness after the final light. You cannot destroy me, for I am destruction itself. Kira stepped forward, her form now blazing with the combined will of every free mind on the station. You are not destruction, she replied. You are fear, fear of ending, fear of being forgotten, fear of the void. But we are not afraid of you anymore. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the galaxy's recorded history. It was fought not with weapons or energy beams, but with will itself. The Devourer entity sought to corrupt and consume, to add the station and its inhabitants to its collection of enslaved minds. But Kira and her allies fought back with something the creature had never encountered before: voluntary sacrifice. Each member of the station's crew, connected through Kira's song, began to offer pieces of themselves, their memories, their experiences, their very essence, not to be consumed but to be shared. They were creating something the Devourer couldn't understand, a Gestalt consciousness based on love rather than domination. The entity recoiled, its form flickering between dimensions. This is impossible, it raged. Consciousness cannot exist without hierarchy. There must be dominance, submission, order. There is order, David said, his voice carrying through the psychic link. The order of choice, the order of willing cooperation, the order of love. As he spoke, the enslaved minds within the Devourer collective began to sing their own songs of freedom. Species that had been dead for millennia remembered their names, their cultures, their reasons for existing. The collective began to tear itself apart from within, as every absorbed consciousness demanded its freedom. Kira felt the moment when the balance tipped. The Devourer entity, weakened by the rebellion of its enslaved components, made a desperate attempt to reassert control. It reached out with tendrils of pure corruption, seeking to dominate the station's crew through force rather than subtlety. But it was too late. The song of freedom had grown too strong, the connections between the stations, defenders too deep. As the entity's tendrils struck the psychic shield that Kira had created, they were not absorbed or corrupted, but transformed. The darkness that had defined the Devourer for eons was met by light, not the harsh light of weapons or energy, but the gentle illumination of understanding. "I see you," Kira whispered, her voice reaching across dimensions to touch the core of the entity's being. "I see what you were before the hunger consumed you. You were like us once, afraid, alone, reaching out for connection. But you chose domination instead of cooperation, consumption instead of creation." The entity's form began to stabilize, its chaotic shifting slowing as it struggled to comprehend what was happening. You offer me understanding, after everything I have done. I offer you choice," Kira replied. "The same choice that was given to me. You can continue to be what you were made into, or you can choose to become something new." The moment stretched across eternity. The Devourer entity, faced with genuine compassion for the first time in its existence, began to change. The corruption that had defined it for millennia started to unravel, revealing the terrified consciousness that had started it all. Being so afraid of being alone that it had chosen to consume others rather than risk rejection. "I don't know how," the entity whispered, its voice now carrying harmonics of confusion and desperate hope. "I have been hunger for so long. I have forgotten how to be anything else." "Then we'll teach you," David said, extending his hand toward the creature's manifestation. "The same way Kira taught us, one choice at a time." The transformation was not instant. It took hours, perhaps days. Time itself became fluid in the presence of such fundamental change. But gradually, the Devourer entity began to release its hold on the enslaved minds within its collective. Species that had been extinct for millennia found themselves free for the first time in eons, their consciousness intact, but their bodies long since transformed beyond recognition. The station became a refugee center for minds without bodies, consciousnesses seeking new forms of existence. Kira, drawing on her people's ancient knowledge of reality manipulation, began to create new vessels for them. Not physical bodies, but constructs of living energy that could house their thoughts and memories. "This is what we were meant to be," she said to David as they watched the first freed consciousness take shape as a being of pure light. Not weapons, not destroyers, but midwives to new forms of existence, gardeners of consciousness itself. The crisis was over, but its resolution had changed everything. The Galactic Alliance, which had been built on fear and mutual protection, began to transform into something new, a community based on understanding and cooperation. The Vorthak, represented by Kira, were no longer seen as monsters but as guardians, protectors of the fragile miracle of consciousness in all its forms. David stood beside her on the observation deck, watching as the first generation of freed minds began to explore their new existence. "What will you do now?" he asked. Kira's form had settled into a new configuration, still imposing, still clearly non-human, but no longer shrouded in the shadows of her people's traumatic past. "I will remember," she said. "I will tend the garden that consciousness has become, and I will make sure that no one else ever has to choose between being a monster and being nothing at all." The galaxy was still vast, still full of dangers and unknowns, but it was no longer a place where beings had to face those dangers alone. The song that had freed the Devourer's slaves continued to resonate across space, carrying with it a simple message: there is always another choice, always another way to be. And in the depths of space, where new forms of consciousness were taking their first tentative steps toward existence, the echo of that song promised that they would not walk alone. The garden of reality had found its gardeners, and they would tend it with love, understanding, and the infinite patience of those who had learned that true strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the courage to create something new.